Hello, you are listening to an archived worship service of First Presbyterian Church, Columbus, Mississippi. Thank you for listening.
Today we come to a familiar story. This familiar story of Mary and Martha, a story so familiar to the church that it has spawned its own personality litmus test. You've been asked before, or you have at least contemplated before, are you a Mary or a Martha? This is one of those tests that declare a person one or the other. It's one of those tests that gets asked to divide groups of people. It's kind of like, are you a Democrat or a Republican? Are you a spender or a saver? Are you a Yankees fan or a Mets fan? Or my favorite, Star Trek or Star Wars? It's a litmus test to divide you into different groups. The personality test. There are the doers. And then there are the thinkers. There's the workers and the studiers. There's action. And there's prayer. So are you a Martha or are you a Mary? It is also a text that has split the church in its interpretation in almost every age. There are many different ways that this text has been addressed by theologians throughout the centuries. Does Luke want to point out that we need no care or want of hospitality as a Christian? Well, that was one way it's been interpreted through the years, that Christians should not need hospitality or care. Or is Jesus asserting that the contemplative life is more important than active service? Well, that is one way that it's been interpreted throughout our time as the church. Or is Luke telling us this story to reject traditional roles for women? Mary now sits at the feet of Jesus, a role usually reserved for men of her age, and yet she is there. This scripture has been used by many to say that traditional roles of men and women are now subverted. Or is it about a family system? The dynamics that are at play when older siblings toil away unthanked, uninvited, dutiful to the last, while the younger siblings are thoughtless and carefree and absent from responsibility. As an older sibling, I've used this as such. But over the years, the church has struggled with exactly what to make of this passage, these few short verses. And like no other text in the Bible, it pulls just as much from us, the reader, from our own life experience, as it does from the words on the page. Meaning it relies on our life, our experiences, to develop what the meaning we take away from this passage. And there's no wonder that this text leaves a great many people and groups feeling a little conflicted. After all, it is a passage centered around a conflict. But before we get too deep in that question that divides us into Marys and Marthas, I think we need to take a step back. The lectionary is wonderful. It helps us pinpoint a section of Scripture for us to study deeply, but it also takes us out of the rhythm of the overall Scripture reading. So let's take a step back, just a small one, to see what happens immediately before and immediately after. Maybe that has something that will help us with this text. This short story comes immediately after Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. Remember? The enemy that becomes neighbor, the one who showed pity, the one who acted to rescue the life of another and provided care. And our text comes immediately before the disciples ask Jesus for deeper teaching, like how to pray. Yes, 2 sentences after this story is over is Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer. Jesus is teaching them how to commune with God, to contemplate a life with the divine. Martha and Mary are positioned then in a dynamic place between care for others and care for self. Loving neighbor, loving God. This is a dynamic turning point, this small narrative. And it makes Jesus' answer to Martha's concern feel like a scale tipping, which is the most important. Loving neighbor or loving God. Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her. In that really short answer to Martha's concern, I think Jesus gives us an important word. Now, I don't like to boil things down to a word, but I think that maybe this is a time that one word can help us understand the whole. Maybe this is less to do with a litmus test or a division of the church or a Christian response. And maybe it's more of an invitation to attune ourselves and identify correctly need. The dying, the bleeding man needed help, protection, attention, care. The disciples needed education, direction, focus, and training. Mary and Martha, the dichotomy we have put on this text is not so much about working or listening, but it's addressing need. Mary and Martha do not teach us what is right, but when is right. That is, need will always be different in the circumstances of life. The what will change depending on the when as it is identified. The artificial divide between doers and thinkers is then broken, because Jesus is not siding with one over the other, telling us which is better or which is worse. But Jesus is helping Martha and the church to pay attention to the need rather than roles to play. And somehow we've missed it. And somehow in our condensing of the text, we think this is all about roles, but it has nothing to do with that. It's about identifying the need. Here's one way I still learn that lesson. I still learn this lesson. And most of the time, it's the hard way. We just returned from this trip to Mexico. And when we go to Mexico, it's often labeled as something. It's called a mission trip. And for us in the Western world, a mission has a connotation that you're going to get something done, a need identified. And for us, it's often clean drinking water for people to change their lives, to increase their health, to help them understand better the education process that goes into it, the ways that we meet a need in the world, and that is a great thing. I like that. It's easy for me to quantify and to justify the money that is expensed in something like this, the plane travel and the hotel stay and the food costs, all those kind of things that I have to justify in my own head, that these are the number of people that have been served, these are the number of lives that have changed, and I can easily do that in my own head when I call it a mission trip. But what about the times that need is changed? What about times where the need is different? I'm left looking like a Martha, missing the cues, ignoring the true need of the moment. Here's how that happened. My good friend Manuel, who has been the minister of Emmanuel Presbyterian Church for over 20 years, and he took over after his father had served that church for almost 30. And now his son, who is in his early 20s, has just finished seminary. He's about 23, 24 years old, and he served this last week as our primary interpreter, and without him, we would have been lost. He teaches English at one of the local schools, and so he was well suited for what we needed him for this week. But one of the ways that he helped instruct us was he took us to the place where he is charged as their minister. Now in Mexico, they have different terminology for the way that churches work. For a church our size that has a called minister, an installed person that serves every single week, that would be a church. But a church that's smaller than that has need only at certain times for someone in my role, or is too small to help with the expenses that would take, is called a mission. So Manuel serves a mission on the hillside of one of the poorest places in Campeche. We went to see this mission. And as we drove up the hill, and it was scary, and my knuckles were white, and it was not an easy experience for me, and so I fell into my easy role of my expectations, helping to meet the need. Manuel was telling us about the neighborhood and the people that came to this church and the struggles that they lived with in day-to-day life. He said many of the women here are pregnant by 14. And they have to drop out of school, and so there's no education after that. And so they become dependent on the system, and the system is broken, and it is awful. And we talked a little bit about what you do as a minister in that set of circumstances. And I asked him a question I thought would be a really great question. I said, Manuel, how do you preach hope in a place where hope is so out of reach? I left him kind of stunned. He didn't know how to answer, or he couldn't answer in English for a few minutes, and I thought I'd done a really good thing in my role as teaching him and helping him come to better conclusions. I wanted to be there to help him resolve pastoral care issues. My role is teacher, after all. And so I played into that as I helped him identify, well, this would be a really good thing for people in this kind of understanding. And have you thought about educational roles and different things you can rely on your presbytery for? And I started listing off a number of things that I would do if I were in the same situation. We got into the church, into the small cinder block room with a cat walking above us on the tin roof making noise that we couldn't identify. And he said, worship is a little different here. Most of the time we can only gather late in the evening. Most of the time when we gather together, we listen to each other's stories. And it doesn't look like this. They get the small chairs that are made of plastic, and they turn them around in a big circle, and they sit and they talk to each other. And the question is, how are you? And I said, oh, that is great. That's a great way to open people up and to do all these different things. And I started going through my spiel again about all the ways that he could be better at pastoral care, this young 23-year-old that I was helping to educate. And he looked at me and he said, Tom, how are you? And I was not ready for that. I was sitting in a chair that carried the weight of tremendous brokenness. I was sitting in a chair that served the purpose each week of helping people gain rest, that they didn't have rest in the rest of their life. I was there to educate. I was there to play a role. And suddenly I was out of it. And suddenly the spotlight was on me. How are you? And I did what most good preachers would do and most Westerners would do. I just deflected. That's a great question. People ought to think about questions like that. We ought to bring some of that back to our church. I think that would be a great thing to do. And he just looked at me with this bizarre look on his face saying, you're missing it. You just don't get it, do you? What was the need? Tom, you busy yourself. You're distracted. Manuel is taking and giving what you need, the better part, the thing that will not be taken away. Lesson learned. Lesson learned. There's a need of only one thing right now. Choose what is better. It says Jesus. Sometimes that is work. Sometimes that is action. Sometimes that is hospitality as a great sacrifice. And other times that is training. That is care of the self. It is rest. Or it is intimacy. Too often, when we only play a role, it is easy to become worried and distracted, only to find out that our toil is in vain. The better part is to better identify the need, not the role. And often that takes us out of our comfortable places, the defined roles that we take up in spaces that we are comfortable existing. And so if the need changes, maybe that means that the spender becomes a saver, or the saver becomes a spender. If the need changes, maybe that means a political party line needs to change as well. If the need changes, maybe Mary needs to be more like Martha, or Martha needs to be more like Mary. Addressing the need is the better part of our calling and our life together. And so I leave you with a question. What and where is the need? Alan and Susan, will you come share a little bit?
So one of my favorite spiritual writers says that a good way to grow in your faith is to find a liminal space, and that we can all find that in a different way. It can be through meditation or a lot of prayer. It can even be taking a trip and getting out of your comfort zone. So I think that's what maybe happened to all of us, and on this trip. So my experience with that was at the church service, which we had on Wednesday night at the main church in Campeche, with a huge crowd of people. And the pastor pointed out that Wednesday night is their big service. A lot of these people work in the service industry, and they can't come on Sunday, so they're there on Wednesday night. My whole adult life, I've been a church musician, and I'm used to being in charge. I'm used to being a Martha when it comes to music. So it was really pretty funny. We would meet this person and that, and Tom would say, and Susan was our choir director, and Alan sings beautifully. They sing. And we'd say, yeah, we sing. And they'd say, oh, see, wonderful. And that would go on all night, and I would think, they're going to ask us any minute to sing. We're going to get to perform, because if you're a musician, you have to have some ego, and musicians usually have pretty big egos. But it didn't happen that way. The service went along quite beautifully without us, with us sitting on the first row, having to listen, having to be ministered to. And they did a beautiful, wonderful job of it. We had to laugh. They sang. They had all sorts of instruments, and they sang songs that were in Spanish. They sang 2 songs in English, which they had all gone to the trouble to learn, and we're not even attempting to sing the Spanish. But then they said, and we want to share one of your songs with you. We want to sing Amazing Grace together in English. And we were so pleased. But Tom said it sounded like an organ at an American funeral, just very dirge-like compared to their beautiful rhythmic music. So this music Martha had to become a Mary that night. I was in a liminal space. I was taken out of my element. I was not in control. I couldn't yell, boss around. I didn't even get to sing in front of everybody. And God spoke to me.
Well, as you all know, we've been moving business locations for the last year. So I've spent the last year working every day, literally, on that project. And to come to the mission committee meeting one day and be informed that we're due to go to the Yucatan again, I thought, yeah, that's just what I need to be doing. And but we signed on for it when we did the Living Waters thing. You're supposed to go back and revisit the sites to make sure everything's going right. So I said, yeah, okay, I'll do that. And the next thing I knew, there I was sitting on a plane flying to the Yucatan. You could say this trip was a bust. I could say that real easy. The water system that we put in is not being used to capacity. It is being used, however, and it is working fine. The van that we bought to help them use it to capacity is broken. The chances of that van ever being fixed are kind of dicey. The person who runs the system is a very young man. I tried to get in there, and I brought Tom along, and we're going, let's see how we can make this thing work. And, he's doing fine. doing his 25-gallon jugs a day. He could really do a lot more, but he's probably not. But we go to breakfast with them, and 2.5 hours later, we're still sitting at breakfast, talking. I mean, everybody's talking. Everybody's excited. Then we go to the church. Everybody's, showing the things they've done in the church, and they're excited. Then we go next door to one of the people that they're all related. This is the sister of the pastor. We go to her house. She gives us horrible rice milk, super sweet at room temperature for a refreshing beverage, This is the way this thing is going. So you could go, geez, what a way to spend your time. But the pastor and everybody they're loving it. We go to this church service. The church service is rocking. And the people are there for 2.5 hours, They want to talk to everybody. The kids are crowding around Mary Ellen like she's Madonna or something, It's an experience. It's a real experience. And the pastor and I are trying to communicate as best we can. Neither one's speaking very good Spanish or English. And he stops and he says, my father once told me that it is better for me to speak English badly than to not speak English at all. And it is better for you to speak Spanish badly than not to speak Spanish at all. So we're doing Living Waters like we do it, but it's better than not doing it at all. So that's valuable to me.